This is episode 337 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special bonus content. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Alicia Zalasko, Arts and Humanities Editor at Encyclopedia Britannica. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Because I've studied a lot of the early naturalists from sort of the 16th to the 18th centuries, and all of them, or the majority of them, say that it was gone. It was definitely extinct in England and Wales by that time period, including in the Tavy. So the most famous of them is John Raye, who's probably the most reliable. And he says, these animals have been cut down to hunt by hunters all the way to the final extermination, and their stock in England and Wales is finally extinct.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Henry IV, Part 1, Vernon refers to the clothing of young Harry, saying, quote, "I saw young Harry with his beaver on," end quote. There are at least 6 other references to the word beaver known in Shakespeare's plays. And while many of Shakespeare's references are actually talking about the helmet feature that opens and closes on the front of a soldier's face, the references might be based on the anatomy of a beaver, the animal, and they are a reflection of the place that the animal, the beaver, had in the UK, because this animal had been really plentiful right up until Shakespeare's lifetime. They had been hunted for their fur, their meat, and their castoreum that was used in products like perfume. And while beavers were once native to Britain, they were hunted to extinction during the 16th century and have only recently started to be reintroduced to the UK. Our guest this week, Raye, joins us to talk about the journey from native species to extinction for the beaver, how that impacted commerce and the landscape of England during Shakespeare's lifetime, and to update us on the efforts to reintroduce the beaver to the UK that have been taking place in our lifetime. Dr. Raye is an associate lecturer at the Open University. Their animal and plant histories have been published in the Herpetological Journal, British and Irish Botany, Notes and Records, and Archives of Natural History. Their Atlas of Early Modern Wildlife reconstructs the range of over 150 species from the 15th to the 18th centuries based on the accounts of local naturalists, travelers, and antiquaries. Leah is currently a volunteer surveyor for amphibian and reptile conservation and the Bat Conservation Trust. Find out more about Lee in the show notes for today's episode, along with links to their social networks where you can connect with them and follow their work. Hello, Lee. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. It's lovely to be here.
What is the specific kind of beaver that was native to the UK during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, that's a good question. The straightforward answer is that it was the Eurasian beaver. So the beaver which was found in Europe and across the north of Asia. So not the North American Castor canadensis, but the Castor feber of Europe. But I have a cheeky answer for you as well. And my cheeky answer is that in Shakespeare's time, and when Shakespeare talks about beavers, quite often what he's actually talking about is not a beaver at all. That sometimes the term beaver was used for the front part of a helmet, which covers the sort of the nose and the mouth, which you can raise when you're eating and drinking and lower when you're going into battle.
Which does look like the large front teeth of the animal beaver that chomps. So I wonder if there's a connection etymologically there. That would be fun to chase down.
Yeah, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. Oh, you have to let me know about that.
When did the extinction of the beaver in England occur? Because I know that I've read during Shakespeare's lifetime, the beaver wasn't actually there, perhaps. And how do we know when this happened?
So this is a complicated and controversial one, so you'll have to stick with me. We know that in the first millennium, so from the year 1 all the way to the year 1000, the beaver was pretty widespread in Britain. It was found all over the place, and there's lots of archaeological evidence that it might have been hunted and exploited in that time period. Most excitingly, maybe in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which is quite famous and has that memorable helmet from early medieval England, we have what seems to be a case for a lyre, the musical instrument, made of beaver fur, which I think is quite amazing. As we go into the second millennium, so getting a little bit closer to Shakespeare, the beaver seems to be getting rarer and rarer. So there's a famous text from the 12th century called Gerald of Wales's Itinerary of Wales, and it's sort of a travel log of Gerald's travels around Wales in the late 12th century. And he says, he's talking about the River Tavy. He says, "The Tavy has another remarkable peculiarity. Of all the rivers in Wales and those of England south of the Humber, it's the only one where you find beavers." That's from the Lewis Thorpe Penguin edition, the Penguin Classics edition. And we actually don't have any evidence, any straightforward evidence that he was wrong about that. He might well have been right. North of the Humber, in North England, we know that the beaver does stick around longer. So there's some sort of beaver-chewed wood from the 14th century. So that's up in Kielder Forest, just south of the Scottish border. But in the south of England, he might well have been right that was either the last beaver or potentially one of the last beavers. He might have been exaggerating about there being only one river full of them. And from there on, it gets really debated. So my personal view, because I've studied a lot of the early naturalists from sort of the 16th to the 18th centuries, and all of them, or the majority of them, say that it was gone. It was definitely extinct in England and Wales by that time period, including in the Tavy. So the most famous of them is John Raye, who's probably the most reliable. And he says, "These animals have been cut down to hunt by hunters all the way to the final extermination, and their stock in England and Wales is finally extinct." He's talking about a few animals there, but one of them is the beaver. But there is another school of thought, and there is a bounty record which seems to be paid for a beaver from all the way in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century. So if that's trustworthy, there might have been this hidden relict population of beavers dotted around. There are lots of animals, bounty records paid for animals in the parish records, bounties started being paid after the Tudor Grain Acts. The Tudor Grain Act, the second one, which lists animals, does not list the beaver, but lots of animals were hunted and did have bounties paid on them when they weren't in that Tudor Grain Act. So that doesn't necessarily mean that this wasn't a beaver. So if we accept that evidence, the beaver might have been sticking around much longer. And of course, in Scotland, we know it was around much later, until at least the 16th century, and perhaps went extinct there in the 17th.
So what's different about the landscape of Shakespeare's England versus his parents or grandparents in the absence of the beaver being there? Because this is a significant difference between them being all over the place, like the archaeological record suggests that they were, from there being, very, very few, if any, by the time Shakespeare is living.
Yeah, that's a really fun question. And it sort of ties into why the beaver went extinct as well. If we think it went extinct early, was that because of hunting? And if we think it went extinct late, could that have been habitat change? The habitat, the landscape of England was changing a lot in the Shakespearean period. And I thought it would be fun. I brought along a couple of verses from poems written near the time period just for us to have a look at.
Oh, we're all about early modern poems around here, so please share those.
The first one is quite famous. It's called The Pout's Complaint, and it comes from the Fenland area of England, which is sort of a wetland environment in the east of England, which goes all the way from Suffolk up to Lincolnshire. And this was, in Shakespeare's time, a great wetland, and it supported a local economy of people who were fishing and fowling, so catching birds as well as fish, using the reeds there for thatching, and making boats and stilts to walk across the fens with. But in Shakespeare's time and into the 17th century, people were starting to think about draining those fens. The sort of elites of society thought of the fens as being disease-ridden, and I think there were malaria mosquitoes there, so they weren't entirely wrong. But we have something amazing from around 1619, once attributed to someone called Penny of Wisbeck that we know nothing else about. This has been This is a poem which has been analysed by Todd Borlick and Claire Egan in an article by them, but it's called Pout's Complaint. And the magnificent thing about this poem is that you're supposed to read it in the voice of a pout, which seems to be a burbot, which is a fish in the cod family, but which is a freshwater fish and seems to have been really common in the fens. It's now actually extinct in Britain, and I imagine that the destruction of the fens didn't do much for it, but it went extinct quite recently. So the first verse goes, "Come, brethren of the water, and let us all assemble to treat upon this matter which makes us quake and tremble. For we shall rue it if it be true the fens be undertaken. And where we feed in fen and reed, they'll feed both beef and bacon." Magnificent poem, right?
It's wonderful.
That one, I really like it, and I like it as well because it seems to suggest that all of the fish and the birds and the humans of the local area would get together and fight off the the drainers of the fens. But that's just one example. Maybe one poem is enough, but that's one example of
it's a precursor to Animal Farm, the fighting back of the animals against the change.
Yes.
Well, how were beavers viewed before they went extinct? I mean, were they wild animals that were hunted for pelts, or was there ever a situation where they were being raised on purpose for producing the pelts?
They weren't being farmed exactly, but something quite similar was happening in that I think beavers were quite strictly protected in some parts of Britain. So the best evidence of this is in the medieval Welsh law codes. And in the medieval Welsh law codes, beavers are listed as being suitable for the clothes of the king and the queen. And because they were suitable for the clothes of the king and the queen, whenever you kill a beaver, whenever anyone kills a beaver, they're supposed to send the value of that beaver to the king or the queen. And as well as that, you're not supposed to kill any beavers unless you've got permission from the landowner, of course. So taking these things together and considering that the value of a beaver was very high, it was just as high as sort of a house of a sort of ordinary servant type person. The only people who could have really afforded to hunt beavers would have been really rich landowners and potentially people hunting on behalf of the king or queen. And there's something actually quite similar in England. From the late medieval period into the early modern period, we have the English sumptuary laws coming in, which dictate what different classes of people should be wearing. And it's really interesting because they're not usually very specific, although one of them does list beaver as being only suitable to sort of the clergy and the knights and the upper sort. But in 1363 sumptuary law, it's quite clear that the only people who should be wearing imported furs are, among the merchant class, are merchants owning £1,000 of property, which is so high. But in Canterbury Tales, which of course was written just within this time period, in the general prologue, there is a merchant there who wears a Flemish beaver's hat, a beaver hat made of beaver fur from Flanders. So that was definitely an imported fur. So that merchant, the merchant in the general prologue, he's first introduced, and this is one of the first things we're told about him. So it seems as if what we're being told is that he was very flashy. And also, of course, he was on his way to a pilgrimage. So for him to be wearing his flashiest clothes and up on his high horse tells us a little bit about him. And unless he was exaggerating his wealth, which some people and did in this time period, this is telling us that he took himself very seriously and he was very rich.
What changes in the culture or commerce do we see happen in response to the beaver being gone? So once it's left, how do things shift when that resource is no longer there?
So that's a really interesting question. Of course, it depends on when you think the beaver was gone, and of course, to what degree the beaver was gone. Because if there was a tiny population of beavers, they might not have been culturally that relevant. But if you take sort of the early extinction scenario, which I tend to cling to, what we seem to see is increased confusion in texts which mention beavers between beavers and otters and badgers. And sometimes people get the three of them a bit confused. And we also see some transferal of folklore about beavers to other animals. So early on, you have this idea that, this is from antiquity actually, that beavers bite so hard and they don't let go until they hear the breaking of bone. And suddenly other animals seem to start to have this folklore said about them. And you quite often see that after animals go extinct. But perhaps the biggest change is in beaver fur importations. So Elsbeth Veal looked at these, and she found that in the 14th century, there were thousands and thousands of beaver furs being imported into London to make things like beaver fur hats. But in the 15th century, these dry up. And by the time Shakespeare comes around, there are almost no beaver skins. Well, she couldn't find any records of beaver skins being imported in that time period. And funnily enough, after the sort of colonization and the establishment of trade routes with the New World, we get beaver hats coming back into fashion in the 17th century. So in Shakespeare's time, we're seeing sort of a low point in the beaver's profile, and also it seems that beaver was a very big business. So it might even have been that the loss of beavers and the lack of fur like beaver in Europe might have been one of the financial motivations for some of the awful colonialism, which was done elsewhere in the world.
That was my thought was, yeah, it's amazing that is, I mean, because that's pretty stark. Thousands of them being imported for goods in the 14th century. And then just 200 years later, there's none that we can find being imported for this purpose right before, because I think of places like Jamestown, that the beaver pelts were kind of the foundational export for these colonies to find their feet and be functional. That, and I think tobacco was another one that was huge, but they were major exports to provide the money for the new colonies. So it does suggest that there was a great demand for them back in Europe where they were being sold. So it's interesting to see it kind of rise and fall. I think I agree with you. It's like the desire for beaver clothing didn't diminish, but the supply definitely changed. And so as far as the economy, there was kind of a dip in, well, now we got to go find somewhere else to get these. And then once they found a new source, it must have increased again. When it comes to piecing together the history of the Eurasian beaver, what resources have you used and how are your discoveries being applied? I know you mentioned some archaeological evidence as well as primary documents that are helping to inform this story. So tell us about what is helpful to you when you're investigating this history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mostly look at textual documents myself, and we call those historical sources specifically rather than archaeological sources. And we're so lucky for the early modern period that all of the printed sources, or I should say, a lot of the printed sources are available for free online nowadays. So we've got the Internet Archive, of course, and Google Books, the Biodiversity Heritage Library, and places like that. If you're lucky enough to have institutional credentials, you might even have access to early English books online. Some of their stuff's online for free, but a lot of it is behind that paywall. But that's so good because you get to have the access to the full text search. In terms of my work, the way that my work has been applied is because in order to reintroduce an animal, you have to know, or you should really know, why it went extinct and when it went extinct. Because if you don't know those things, it might just go extinct again as soon as you introduce it. So sort of a lot of my work feels finicky, but it has that real important function that without knowing the ins and outs of an extinction, you are not really in a place to restore or to reintroduce that species. And also general conservation quite often is interested in restoring environments or restoring landscapes. And when you think of that word restore, you have to ask, when are we going to restore to? Are we going to restore a landscape to what it looked like 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago? Because although things have happened very fast over the last 100 years and over the last 200 years, nature and the landscape has always been changing. And sometimes we have this sort of simplistic view that before, say, the Industrial Revolution or before the 20th century, nature was in this pristine state, but it's always been changing. So we have to have those that idea of what we're restoring towards in order to carry out our restoration.
Which I guess begs the question of whether or not there is a plan to reintroduce the beaver to the UK and reestablish that once native population. Is there a project in the works to bring them back to the UK?
Oh, there are so many projects in the works, and it's really fun actually watching them all. So when I first started researching the beavers sort of over 10 years ago, the most exciting thing going on was that in Knapdale, in southwest Scotland, in Argyll, there was an official trial re-release of beavers into the landscape. And that eventually it worked really well, and the beavers didn't cause too much trouble, so they're allowed to stay. But in the meantime, while that was going on, it was realized that lots of beavers had been accidentally, or perhaps more probably illegally, released elsewhere. And so, for example, in the River Tay and in Perthshire in Scotland, there are now many, many, many times more beavers than there ever were in the official trial. And some of the populations that have been released like that have actually now got official recognition. So in the River Otter in southwest England, there was a population of beavers there which were going to be removed, but so many people were sort of complaining about them that we ended up deciding that they should stay. So they got permission to stay in the landscape. And then as well as that, really interestingly, the ones that are getting the most press at the moment are these introductions into enclosures, which are quite common. So every now and then you'll see in the news something like beavers released to this English county for the first time in 400 years. They are now found here again. And there's two things wrong with these articles. First of all, that 400 years figure is usually not based on anything concrete from that area. And the second thing, more importantly, is that usually when these beavers are actually being released, they are being released into enclosures. So they're being released into what are essentially huge cages. And to call that a reintroduction or even rewilding, as some people do, it feels a bit cheeky in some ways. But again, I could go on about that for ages, I think.
Well, I'm excited to learn that they are coming back to the UK, even if their natural life in the true wild is somewhat slow or experiencing a transition, I guess, in some parts. That's exciting to know that they are coming back as a native population. I think it's fun to think that they could come home essentially and be put back and hopefully be not hunted to extinction this time. We'll learn from the history that we've studied. Well, I know we would love to learn more about this topic and that you are an excellent person to ask about books and resources we should begin with when we want to explore the history of the beaver in the UK even further. So where would you suggest we start?
The very best book on beavers in Britain is Beavers in Britain's Past, which is by Professor Brian E. Coles of the University of Exeter. It's a fantastic book. Really, I don't necessarily agree with all of her conclusions, but the way that she's found so much evidence and put it all together, it's so beautiful and elegant. It's an incredible book. But as well as that, if you wanted to go back a bit further, the bestiary.ca website pulls together all of the medieval bestiary texts, a lot of them from the 13th century in Britain. And you can see some fantastic pictures of beavers doing outrageous things. So that's another really good resource.
These are excellent resources, and we will link to all of these in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Lee, I want to ask you a bonus question here because I had a patron ask about this, and we covered it briefly in a previous episode, but we did not have the opportunity to answer this question exactly about beavers. We know that they were imported for their fur, their meat, and their castoreum, but we weren't clear where the castoreum came from on a beaver. Can you answer for us, where was that on the beaver itself? And then what was it actually used for?
Yeah, that's a fun question. Castoreum technically comes from the anal glands of beavers, I'm afraid. Although in the medieval period, it was popularly believed that it actually came from their testicles, and it was popularly believed that they would castrate themselves and throw their testicles at any hunters who would chase them. The castoreum was really widely used in the medieval period, and it was widely used for pain relief and also swellings and all sorts of things. There's a lovely section on it in Bartholomew of England's account of the beaver. So you can learn more there.
Thank you for answering that question for us. I wanted to throw that in here at the end because particularly if you're going to explore the bestiary website and look at some of these medieval images of the beavers, if they are images of them castrating themselves or other surprising images of beavers, I hope that helps you understand why that was going on, because that was based in some of those beliefs about where that castoreum actually came from. Now, Lee, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh, a fun question. I was thinking of all my favorite novels, but of course I would get so sick of them if I was reading them again and again on a deserted island. So I thought I probably want to bring along something to study. And my favorite study source is a 17th century source. It's called Scotia Illustrata, or sometimes also called the Prodromus of Natural History, or the Prodromus Historiae Naturalis. It's by Robert Sibbald, and it describes the state of the environment in Scotland in the 17th century. And it's based on the answers to questionnaires which he sent to people all across Scotland. And it lists all of the animals and all of the plants and their medical uses and all of the diseases and how they were treated and all of the parts of the landscape, the rivers and islands and lochs. So it's a really, really fun source. I've been translating it on and off for years, and every time I look into it, I find something else new. So I would go to the desert island with that, and when I came back 10 years later, I'd have loads of fun insights for everyone.
I think that's a fascinating choice. I understand exactly why you would spend tons of time in that book and never get bored, as well as the added benefit of being able to travel to Scotland in your mind instead of being stuck on the deserted island. So I can see why that would be an excellent selection for your desert island choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Wow. Last year, I brought out my Atlas of Early Modern Wildlife, which looked at the state of nature in Britain and Ireland between 1529 and 1772. So just before and during and just after Shakespeare's time. And after that, I've had lots of conversations with people and I found new sources. So at the moment, I've actually got a bit of research coming out quite soon, which is going to be a paper on the natural history of Devon in the Shakespearean period, which I think is going to be really exciting. And that is imminently coming out. So follow me on social media if you want more on that.
Absolutely. We will place links to Lee's social media so you can follow them there. And thank you so much, Lee, for being here today and sharing with us the history of the beaver for Shakespeare's lifetime, both his extinction and the joyful return to the UK of this exciting animal. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this history with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me, Cassidy.
The entire list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with more information about our guests and how you can follow their work, is available in the show notes for today's episode. You can find all these links right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 337. While you're on the show notes page, if you would like to see more in-depth visual history related to our show today, including illustrations of the beaver from that bestiary that I was telling you about, as well as primary documents, archaeological finds, and other tidbits related to the history of the beaver, its extinction, and its return to the UK, then be sure to click the patron button on the regular show notes page. That button allows you to either join us as a patron or log in using your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of our show. And all the bonus content site-wide at CassidyCash.com will expand right there on the page. Again, that URL for this week's show notes is CassidyCash.com/episode 337. That's CassidyCash.com/EP337. Just look for the giant "This Post Expands" picture on the show notes page, and that's where all the bonus content is located. That Shakespeare Life is completely free to listen each week, and that's made possible by our patrons. When listeners like you sign up to support our show on Patreon, it allows us to research topics that you want to know about. We are allowed to compile great questions and connect with amazing guests that can come on the show and share history directly with you. To say thank you for contributing to our show, we build That Shakespeare Life directly with our patrons, giving patrons access to the making of our show with sneak peeks of upcoming episodes and the chance to submit your questions you'd like to have asked on the air. If you love learning history with us here each week and you'd like to be a direct player in keeping That Shakespeare Life on the air every week, then consider becoming a patron today. Sign up right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.